Hello, let me introduce our presenter. He is SangUk Kim and JeongHun and SeongHui and HyeonBeom. We will give you a presentation about Korean fairy tales. This is index. First, we will talk about features of fairy tales, and second, example of fairy tales. Third, characteristics of Korean fairy tales and presentation summary. Korean fairy tales are transmitted by mouth to mouth for a long time. So it reflects Korean's history and culture well. This is three features of Korean fairy tales. First, culture. Confucianism affects for respecting for the other person and patriarchal society. And second, history. Korea suffered many invades from neighbor country, so it affects the confusion of society to Korean fairy tales. And last, promotion of virtue and reproval of vice affects the Korean fairy tales. And now Sanguk will check these characters through interesting story.
I introduce Kongjipachi fairy tales. Maybe you had heard this story when you were young, but listen carefully, please. Once upon a time, Kongji lived with his father. Kongji's father accepted the stepmother and Pachi was born from her. And then, to Kongji's sorrow, Kongji's father was dead by illness. After he was gone, Pachi's mother bothered Kongji by making her do something very hard, like plowing a field, filling a broken jar with water, and weaving clothes. When she plowed a field, a black cloud from the sky helped her task, and when she filled broken jar with water, a toad stopped up with whole of jar. One day, the party was held for head of village. Kongji would like to join the party, but she can't go to the party for task from her stepmother. At that time, Barry comes Kongji, replace her task and give her new clothes. Thanks to Barry, Kongji can go to the party and the head of village fall in love with her. Similar to common fairy tales, Kongji married and lived with him happily. But the story is not over. There is more original story about these fairy tales. JeongHun will introduce about that.
Because of the characteristic of fairy tale transmitted by mouth to mouth, the original story was changed. I will tell you the original story. First, after marriage, Pachi apologized to Kongji, and Kongji believed her. And someday, Pachi called Kongji for a walk, but Pachi pushed Kongji to pond, and Kongji died. Pachi decided to disguise as Kongji, and she lived with head of village. But Kongji resurrected as a lotus, and she started to bother and punish Pachi. And head of village noticed that Pachi killed Kongji, and he was very furious, and he killed Pachi and sent her to her mother, and her mother died by shock. And after this, Sungyi will summary our presentation.
Until now, we have introduced the typical example of Korean fairy tales 공지팟쥐. Then, from now on, I will tell you about two characteristics of Korean fairy tales. Please read it together. First,
Reflection of Korean culture.
and the second,
Reflection of Korean history.
let me introduce the first characteristics. Reflection of Korean culture more in detail. First of all, Korean historically used to following a male dominated society very long time. In the stories like 사시남정기, we can see the male-focused family atmosphere and conflicts of women surrounding them. Also, during the period of the three states in Korean, 삼국 시대, and during the unified Silla, 통일신라 시대, Buddhism was a state religion in Korea. We can usually find some Korean literature reflects Buddhism such as Gunmo. Also, during the Joseon, state religion was Confucianism. In the stories of 효녀신청 or 홍길동전, we can find Confucianism. We also can find many stories which have second characteristics, reflection of Korean history. Korean has its own very long spectacle history, especially the Japanese invasion of Korea in 1592 in Korean 임진왜란, and the Manchu's War of 1633 and the Korean 병자호란 are often used for main subjects for Korean fairy tales. For example, the Bak시전 has a background of the Manchu's War of 1633. However, the storyline of Bak시전 actually tells the opposite result of the war. In fact, the Korean at the time Joseon were defeated by Cheong, today's China. However, in the story, the woman hero Bak lead the war Joseon's victory, because it reflects the mind of Joseon people that want to be consoled and cheered up in literature ways, even though it was an imaginary world. Meanwhile, Bak시전 is worth unwantedly tells about woman hero as a main character. Because of the time limits, I can tell you all the storylines that reported during the presentation. All these stories reflect Korean culture and history very well. How was our presentation? Was it useful?
Yeah.
I hope you have informative and beneficial time. Thank you for listening.
Oh.